Is he becoming increasingly authoritarian?
To a certain degree, I would say yes, but only in certain degrees. I would say that the effort to, for example, take a 5% VIG, just a kickback from companies like Nvidia and AMD, and taking a stake in Intel and creating a scorecard for businesses to judge whether or not they are supportive enough of the president's agenda with the requisite zeal to avoid the president looking down on them, casting the eye of Sauron on them.
There was no let up during the summer in the hectic pace Donald Trump has set for his second term. He was busy with tariffs, Ukraine, President Putin deploying the National Guard on the streets of the capital, maybe soon Chicago as well, rounding up even more illegal migrants, taking even more revenge on his enemies, and grabbing chunks of private enterprise for the government, in places replacing market capitalism with state capitalism, a new American economic policy with Chinese characteristics. So let's catch up on all of this and more with a good friend of the show, Noah Rothman, senior writer at the National Review. Noah, let me begin with a broad question. In what way now is Trump world different from when we last spoke as summer was just getting underway?
I think it's very different, and it depends on where you look. But I would say, specifically in terms of foreign policy, the president's movement, the MAGA movement, its loudest members, we should say, many of whom populate very significant and influential roles in the Pentagon, are leery of the execution of what I believe are American objectives abroad, the pursuit of its interest in places like the Middle East, culminating in Operation Midnight Hammer, the strike on Iranian nuclear programs. I think that was disorienting to the MAGA movement. And it doesn't fit with what we're seeing out of the Pentagon in terms of its strategy to relocate American assets to the North American theater, in particular to secure the Caribbean against drug smugglers in Venezuela, a very legally dubious operation, but it's predicated on this assumption that the United States should retreat closer to its shores and foment create incentives, at least, for the reestablishment of inviolable spheres of influence elsewhere. So in that sense, it's been a disorienting summer for the MAGA movement. Less so when it comes to tariffs, less so when it comes to the deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., as you mentioned earlier. Certainly less so with the assumption of state roles in businesses like Intel and Nvidia and AMD, all of which are very much in line with a Jacksonian view of what American power should be, which is what the president's movement believes in, and what the president himself sometimes say is his objectives.
Unlike Jackson, he's picked a fight with the National Bank, this time called the Federal Reserve. Let me come straight in on foreign policy, since you mentioned that. I mean, far from ending the war in Ukraine on his first day, he's not managed to end it in 8 months. No surprise there, really. But his best mate, Mr. Putin, seems to be stringing him along. And yesterday, Mr. Trump indicated he was ready to ramp up sanctions against the Kremlin. Do you think he'd really do that?
I think he may. I'm wondering what the delay is. The president does have a tendency to get frustrated with Vladimir Putin. It takes a lot for him to get there, I should concede. Nevertheless, we have seen the president ramp up sanctions, for example, on India, specifically in response to its purchasing of illicit Russian oil exports. Now, he hasn't followed up anywhere else. Turkey and China are two of Russia's biggest oil importers. And if you were to impose sanctions,
China buys more than India.
Yeah, quite. And if you were to impose secondary sanctions on Chinese oil consumers, Americans would feel it in their wallets. It would hurt, which is one of the reasons why Joe Biden's administration did not pull that trigger. And it's perhaps the reason why the president is not pulling on it now. Nevertheless, the reason, in my view, why those negotiations have failed, where the MAGA movement emphasizes the degree to which the president negotiated ceasefires and conflicts in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Caucasus, so why not here? I would say that it has a lot to do with the fact that the president and his movement, in particular, the people who are in high positions of authority in this administration, the vice president, the office of director of national intelligence, and others, don't view that conflict as one that can be taken on its own terms, by which I mean they discount the degree to which Ukrainian interests and Russian interests conflict. They view it through domestic politics. They have a tendency to talk about it in terms that relate to American domestic interests. The people in the foreign policy establishment in particular, who endorse and support an extroverted American presence on the world stage. They don't like those people. They don't want to see them win any sort of domestic political victory. So they end up talking about this conflict in domestic political terms, which is very confusing. And it's part of the reason why they haven't wrapped their hands around the fundamental central problem with this conflict, which is that Vladimir Putin has objectives he thinks he can achieve on the battlefield. And until he doesn't believe that anymore, this conflict will continue.
Tariffs have been Mr. Trump's economic policy of choice, but his power to wield that weapon is being challenged in the courts. It'll reach the Supreme Court next month. If the Supremes rule against him, where will that leave his economic policy?
It will significantly truncate the president's ability to do what he wants to do, which is to rebalance the global trade agenda. And the president would benefit from that politically, domestically. He will be able to say that the Supreme Court blocked him and thwarted his wholly noble and righteous vision for a new American economy. And so you're not going to enjoy that. And he'll get to demagogue it and posture as though this was stolen from you. He would benefit from it because the tariffs have significantly undermined a lot of elements of the American economy that he was benefiting from. Hiring is slowing in the United States. Consumer confidence is eroding in the United States, albeit slightly, but that could continue to drift in that direction. And the president would benefit from these unnecessary impositions on American producers and just the dead weight associated with the cash that we are now just casting into the gaping maw of the U.S. Treasury, designed, I suppose, to pare down the American debt and its obligations on borrowing. But it's not having much of an effect on the amount of borrowing that we have to do because the Congress continues to spend. So the president would benefit from a Supreme Court decision that goes against him as much as he would rail against it.
The latest job figures are pretty dire. For the first time in a while, there are now more job seekers than vacancies. How would you, it seems you would characterize the state of the US economy at the moment is not great.
Well, honestly, I think that this is kind of a cliche, but the fundamentals are not bad. And if the president's tariff regime, a much more streamlined and consistent and thoughtful tariff regime, or maybe no tariff regime preferably, would certainly contribute to the consumer spending that has pared back over the last couple of months as people are experiencing a lot of uncertainty about the near term. I do think the American economy would be poised to fire on most cylinders, if not all cylinders, in the absence of this tariff regime, but it is producing a lot of drag on the economy. There's no way around it. You have to acknowledge that. And the problem is the president is unwilling to acknowledge it. Right now we're talking about the law and the degree to which Congress has delegated the authority to impose tariffs in this broad way in which the president says he has that authority. And by the way, he may yet prevail at the Supreme Court. His argument, which continues to lose at lower courts, is that these are national security interests and the president has vast authority in the realm of foreign policy and national security. That may yet prevail at the Supreme Court. We don't know yet. But if it doesn't, the president can say that he was thwarted and retreat to a much more market-oriented, supply-side-oriented approach to macroeconomics, which would serve him and his administration well.
One of the growing criticisms of Mr. Trump from the left, but not just from the left, is that he acts in an increasingly authoritarian manner. Was that a trend that continued through the summer? Is he becoming increasingly authoritarian?
To a certain degree, I would say yes, but only in certain degrees. I would say that the effort to, for example, take a 5% VIG, just a kickback from companies like NVIDIA and AMD and taking a stake in Intel and creating a scorecard for businesses to judge whether or not they are supportive enough of the president's agenda with the requisite zeal to avoid the president looking down on them, casting the eye of Sauron on them. I think that actually does apply in that realm. Where I don't think it applies is the deployment of the National Guard to places like Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. I do believe that the president's authority there, the federalization of the National Guard, Washington, D.C. has special status, and in Los Angeles, where they deployed very narrowly in support of the LAPD and only to protect federal installations, and then rolled up that operation very quietly. I think that he's on sound ground there. I don't think that would necessarily be true in Chicago. It's possible. If the president is deploying National Guard to Chicago to protect federal institutions, he is within his rights to do that. The problem is he's not going to say that's what he's doing. He's going to try to convince his voters that he's acting outside the bounds of law because that's what these times demand.